in quantitative ways of thinking in the kinds of problems that you might be excited about tackling. And again, just as a rule, as a principle, anybody can stop, interrupt at any point of time. I have interruptions designed already in place, but every lecture is supposed to be a conversation. And I think this time there will also be a little homework associated with what we'll cover today. So I think I had mentioned to folks about Fermi's problems. We'll talk a little bit about that today. I do want to talk a little bit about learning how to search for data, especially data about problems that you're excited about, and especially in the exercise, the first problems that we will all do, you will both search for known and new data sources that you might not have had the chance to actually use before. And I mean, I think I can imagine in a certain set of a scenario that some of you are really well versed with working with numbers and working in very quantitative ways. You know, if you have an engineering background, a science background, that's very obvious. And some of you might have dealt with it in a context of data and statistics. But I think what I want to make sure is everybody's on the same page, and the choice of projects will indeed depend quite a lot on that framework. So today's class is really much more about pencil and paper. Frankly, there is no, in terms of the most powerful tool that we have is some of these types of class of quantitative thinking around problems that feel a little bit slippery to actually quantify. So even though you might have had an engineering class in which you did a ton of calculations, you might realize that not everything in those sets of ideas actually translate when you are dealing with a societal context, a social problem. And this is where we will learn quite a lot about learning how to at least make assumptions and declare our assumptions. And I'll bring that in a second. But kind of, I think before getting started, if you're not convinced, here's a beautiful saying. I absolutely love this in this context of, I often say that when you can measure what you're speaking about and express it in numbers, you know something about it. But when you cannot measure it, when you cannot express it in numbers, your knowledge is of meager and unsatisfactory kind. It may be the beginning of knowledge, but you have scarcely in your thoughts advanced to the state of science, whatever the matter may be. I don't know if you all know who said that. Anybody could have almost said that. I think it's a little harsh sometimes because there are certain problems that are very difficult to put in numbers. So I don't want to undermine, and we will discuss certain class of problems like that. But this is Lord Kelvin or Mr. William Thomson. Kelvin is known for, temperature and many other wonderful things. But I think one important aspect of this that you could imagine a scenario in the world where we used to describe a lot of phenomena without putting numbers. And what's happening in medicine very particularly has been fascinating. Diagnostics that used to be hearsay or an art is slowly being quantified. When machines get engaged dramatically, you have to think about a cutoff number where you will declare something is a disease state or not. A lot of problems in biology where we never thought that we could truly quantify them now by measurement tools have actually been quantified. And as many of you know, in developmental economics, it's remarkable to see how quantitative approaches have actually helped. I mean, this whole idea of measuring your impact by itself comes from this framework that it's not a feeling of doing good, but you actually have to measure that impact. It is very hard to measure impact. Sometimes measurement of impact actually goes in a direction that is either you don't like or might be somewhat counterintuitive. So it is difficult. Many agencies that support societally relevant projects and especially philanthropies have moved to impact investment for a long while. So this will go a long way for you to convince people that the problem that you're thinking about is relevant, your solution is relevant, and the kind of intervention that you have thought about, people should pay attention to. So I think in my mind, it's a very important skill that you will learn along the way. I think one of the challenges associated with this is sometimes you can overdo it and not realize a false assumption that you made. So there are caveats in this that you have to be aware of. And we will challenge each other in the exercises that we do, that you all will be given everybody else's assignment. Uh, there is one problem that choose your problem that's dear to your heart. You will write and calculate a number of the scale of that problem, and you will choose I'm not going to grade anything. You will choose a solution from somebody else in the class, and you will poke holes at it. And you can poke holes at it your own problem set as well. But I think it's very important sometimes when somebody else pokes holes at it. But remember, the motto of the class is and not but. So you will add to it rather than just canceling somebody else's ideas. Okay, so let's start with global health. I am assuming you all know what this object that we're seeing here is, but just a show of hands, I'm curious, how many of you have seen this plot or this object that I'm actually showing you here? A few hands. Okay, I see maybe 20-30% of people have seen it. It's one of the most famous plots in global health. This is the map of London. You can see the streets here. And of course, what's very important is this little blue dot. This was the location of a pump. The red dots represent number of cases of cholera that occurred. And we'll kind of talk a little bit about this kind of in the history of John and John Snow. And actually, maybe what might be fun for a second is some of you have not seen this. I'm not going to play this entire video, but I do want you to see the context in which this was done. So let's just spend 2 minutes just watching this.
In 1854, cholera struck the city of London. Over 600 people died in just a few weeks. Physician John Snow is often credited with discovering that cholera is a waterborne disease and with ending the 1854 epidemic by removing the handle from the contaminated broth.
So just very important in that sentence, the outbreak was known, but he did not know the agent or how infection actually spread.
Street pump. The full story is much more interesting.
I'm going to leave it here. The full story is indeed very interesting, and that's something that you should all read about. I think kind of one of the threads around this going back, I mean, again, I don't like prescribing reading assignments per se, but anybody in this room that's interested in global health should dig in and read some of the analysis. It's remarkable when you think about interventions, and this is the start of public health. Frankly, when we think about public health and we say, oh, you have to think beyond the kinds of interventions that are only acting upon just a single person. The fact that this very first public health intervention was driven by data. So what John really did, he walked around. He asked people when their symptoms developed, how many people in the household are actually infected. And you can clearly see this red bubble. You can draw a boundary around it. And what he interpreted was the distance between a water source and a household. This happened to be this one pump that was the shortest distance. And he went and he actually famously removed the handle, and that was the stop of that outbreak. And, I mean, of course, COVID, all of you have seen numbers. You saw how important it was to measure in the context of COVID. But frankly, this was not a trend. And in society and in general, if you had asked a lot of people before and after COVID, we didn't have this in our terminology that we would say, oh, we have these outbreaks, we have these numbers. I remember having conversations with my own family where people would really say, hey, this week I saw that plot. The numbers kind of look high. Maybe you should wear a mask. I mean, this became in our vocabulary. And I think sometimes it works spectacularly. Sometimes it's much more difficult than that. Sometimes resources are not available to be able to make such a high resolution measurement in what you are thinking about. Sometimes the tools might not exist at all for the problem that you're working on. Like, I'll just choose the example that Kavya gave. She talked about a community in Tamil Nadu, and if you want to measure impact on their life with climate, what would you measure? Right? I mean, actually, let's just maybe for a second, uh, Kavya, you are not allowed to answer this question, but everybody else, you are in a rural community in south of India. You want to understand what types of interventions should be there in a community. You are interested in working with children. What would you measure? Is there something that you can measure? And this is not a trick question. uh, I just want to make sure that you all understand how hard this is for real problems. Any comments? What would you measure?
Average educational level or the availability of schools and hospitals in general in the area. So well, the geographical mapping as well as the demographic mapping.
So demographic mapping, just who lives there is a very good start. Did you say educational, mean in terms of literacy levels? Is that what you meant?
Literacy levels and yeah, what is the average graduation rate? What standard have people reached on average? And how does it differ about men and women? Just sort of that. Those
Okay, so that's good. I think that gives you something about who lives there. I'm just curious if anybody can think a little bit from a context of climate and a coastal community. Go ahead, anybody, just jump right in. You don't need permission.
I was wondering when you speak of like a coastal area, one thing that could be interesting is tracking the shoreline or the sea line and how far they
Exactly.
have. Yep.
Yeah, I think I mean, that's fantastic. Maybe where people live. Uh, and in our picture, when we think of a coastal area, you might be thinking of a beach in San Francisco, or that's maybe that's not what a coastline might look like. So it is actually very valuable to map how far from the ocean people live. Anything else that comes to mind? What else would you measure? Remember, what do coastal communities depend on as livelihood?
Like
Fish.
fishing.
Mm-hmm. And I'm assuming, Kavya, you got to eat a lot of fish on your trip. Okay. So what would you measure about fishing?
Maybe how many fishing boats you see.
Yeah, yeah. You can look at statistics of that. You can look at the availability of fish. There are records. Many coastal communities do not maintain formal records of how much fish came to the market, but there are certain classes you can actually talk to people to have at least even broad assumptions to say, hey, how has the fish catch been like for you for the last, say, 10 years? You can talk to grandparents to say what the stories they tell, and from that, try if you can pull out some numbers. And I think, I just chose this as an example. I think we will do this type of an exercise, John's story, and especially in diseases, and you will sometimes find you hit upon a problem where it's so absolutely clear what you should measure. And I just want to highlight that it is not so obvious. I mean, we work in many sets of problems where we struggle. And the big struggle often is, do I measure global metrics? And I think this is what I liked about Kavya's example, that for all problems that I want you to work on, start small. Start with the context. This entire class is about learning how to starting with context. So choose a very local community. Because if I was to now say this problem and say, hey, oh, wait a second, let's do this analysis for the whole world, you might find so much variations that you might not be able to deeply understand. You can do a contrast and compare. Do this for Indonesia and Tamil Nadu. That would be very insightful. But I think there is this balance between when you're thinking a little bit about of what scale that you're choosing and how you even define your problem that you might be excited about. So I think, I mean, I hope this sort of clears the fact that what I am describing on a slide seems trivial, but the exercise that you're all about to do is not really that trivial. And I think the deeper you go in this, the more you will actually enjoy it. Okay, any questions on that before I want to dive deeper in kind of power of numbers for a second? And actually, we'll take a little break and we will then have some of you come up with the problems that you might be excited about and do this exercise again. So, let me say something a little bit fictitious and fun. I enjoy this example a lot. But it explains the power of numbers to me in a really powerful way. The example is, do atoms exist? I'm assuming, how many people here believe that atoms actually exist, that atoms are real? How many people have seen an atom before? So why do you believe atoms exist? And I think, if you think a little bit about back in the history and in the history of science, this was not a settled debate. This played out over 50 years. Tragically, people's lives were lost on this debate. Some of you might know the name Boltzmann. Boltzmann killed himself on this question. He committed suicide, primarily because he had built this incredible theory that explained the laws of thermodynamics in the greatest of detail. Everything anybody could measure fits in the laws. And still, and the irony here is it was the chemists, the so-called chemists that didn't believe, and now you can't even use the word chemistry without this idea. They're the ones that pushed him back to an extent where eventually the final proof, which at least the scientific community agrees to be, which was the Einstein's famous 1905 paper on Brownian motion. And unfortunately, Boltzmann did not get that paper because it was not on the internet. And he did not read that paper and he killed himself. And if it had been just a couple more months, he would have heard about it. But I think the challenge there was that something that you cannot see, how do you believe in it? And none of us have seen an atom, but we have evidence and we have built that evidence through numbers. And something quite beautiful happened during that time. And what happened during that time was measurements, going back to numbers. And this is Jean Perrin's Nobel Prize, essentially. Starting with Einstein and then with Jean Perrin, they decided to apply this theory to estimate the size of an atom, essentially by 20 or 30 different methods. And so what you can see, or you can convert that into Avogadro's number, and you can see here on the plot that you see this little table on the left. What you're looking at is phenomena observed, and based on those phenomena, applying a rigorous theory to then come up with an estimate of what the Avogadro number is, using completely different physical phenomena. So viscosity of gases, you can measure viscosity, which is just how goopy a fluid is or a gas is. Distribution of particles that you see, you can literally take photographs under a microscope, not of the atoms. So this is not atoms. These are just little, you can think of it as when you look at milk, these are emulsions and you see that they're distributed. Gravity is acting on them. They're settling, but the jiggling and wiggling of atoms is pushing them up. This is kind of the conventional idea. And the ratio of this from this distribution you can go back and calculate that number. You can calculate that through Brownian motion, which is this famous plot where you can just watch literally macroscopic particles interacting with thermal noise at the smallest scale, leading to a change. And what's quite beautiful is that some of these like critical opalescence, I can't actually explain this because I don't understand enough about opalescence, but it seems like it has nothing to do with the other phenomena that we talked about, which are related to jiggling and wiggling. And it still gives the order of magnitude the same answer. Blueness of the sky. This is a very famous question everybody asks in physics. Why is the sky blue? And so Jean Perrin goes on and uses the blueness of the sky to estimate a number. Diffusion, flight, radiation, radioactivity, everything led him to this overall rough number, which is the kind of the final nail in the coffin that led to people. And of course, we have taken a long time, even since the 1905, 1910 era, to finally be able to see atoms. But on the other hand, this was proven by numbers. And when you think about, needs and diagnostics, when you think a lot about education, there are lots of slippery problems that you will not convince people that it's even a problem until you can bring many measures and metrics to the table. And so I think, these sets of exercises and coming up with sets of numbers to quantify the problem that you're interested in is actually a very powerful tool. And, you can even answer philosophical questions like, lots of things that have not been quantified in the past. And, I think in biology, and especially when you will deal with problems either in ecology, which is a huge challenge associated with it. And I'm really hoping some of you really pick up ecological context in this class as projects. Biological metrics are much harder to measure. And in fact, Darwin famously said that he deeply regretted this was the one superpower he did not have. He felt that he couldn't play with numbers. And, as you all know, he came up with the theory of evolution amongst other people. But he didn't develop that theory quantitatively. It was based on observations, and it's other people that actually developed that theory quantitatively. So again, it's just he didn't have those sets of skills at that time. Now in the modern era, one of the important things that has happened is people have worked very hard to put numbers and make numbers accessible to you. So we'll talk a little bit about just some of these resources that are readily available to you. You can open up a browser for a second and, so if all of you have computers, you can go on a browser. And I want you to go to this website that is called Cell by Numbers. Let me see, what is the actual website called? Cell Biology by the Numbers. So let me just type that in my browser. Cell Biology by the Numbers. This happens to be a book that was written by Rob Phillips and Ron Milo, and we'll bring up a couple of papers by Ron Milo because he's done the most beautiful work in that space. There is a little search bar here, and it says go, and I'll let you, anybody wants to say, what should I type in that search bar? I just want us to see. This is a database that's really around cell biology, but I'm just curious, let's type in anything we want. Like, for example, let's see if we can type how big is a COVID virus. I haven't done this, so I don't know whether this is in the data. What is the size of SARS virus? Sorry, there was no search. Size of COVID. Let's actually size of virus. Okay. I kind of gave to how big are viruses, how many virons, quantitative genes in a genome, how big are viruses. Let's leave it a little more. It comes up with this set of a scenario, what is called this BNID number. This is a link or an attribute associated with every number that's in this database. And so I can go in here, I can find these sets of numbers. Here is a certain class of comparisons, for example, that you see right here. Here's a whole bunch of viruses. Cowpea mosaic virus, tobacco virus. It has a size associated with it in nanometers. But what I want you to pay attention to is every one of these sources has this unique number, the BNID number. And this attributes to get you to this number to be linked exactly to a source. And this is very important for the assignment. When we will build these class of numbers, it's incredibly important that you keep track of where you got those numbers from. And what's quite remarkable about these data sets, for example, I can click on to this data set. It's associated, it goes back to the original source, and it has related bio numbers for something that you might be interested. This is a tool really designed for biologists. So, it's partially useful for some things, but not. And I think one of the hope is that in many of these problems in education, problems in ecological and environmental challenges, climate, we need data sets like these. People are starting to work on those types of data sets now, but I don't have that many to share. I have a list that I'll share with you all. But it's very important and valuable that all of you play with these data sets because it'll give you a sense of what is available and what you need to estimate. And it's counterintuitive sometimes because you can't actually know a priori what might be available to you. So this is just as an exercise, play with this site, and this will help you hone in some of your skills of sometimes what's available and what's not available. But going back to COVID-2, what was really fascinating that Rob and Milo did, I see a hand. Go ahead, Jenny.
Oh, wait. Instead of using like the textbook version, we previously used just like the website version. I think it does give you like the size of the SARS.
Yeah, I was surprised by that. I think I just clicked on the wrong link. Can you
Yeah, I
share?
think it's just bio numbers instead of book.bio numbers.
I see. Oh, this was the
Or that's the
original.
link that when you clicked on the textbook link, that's the website linked to too.
Yeah, you're right. You just reminded me. This was when Ron Milo was a postdoc. That's when they had started it. So this is the the irony of the more professional website actually doesn't answer the original set of questions. The text search is fantastic. I use that tool all the time. And if some of you are excited about diagnostics, I really want you to dig deep. I'll give you a quick example of this. For example, you're interested in building a diagnostics for malaria. How do you know how many parasites per microliter you need to detect? You could make the most fabulous molecular detector for parasites, and it might be hypersensitive, and it actually is not at all useful in the field unless you know in a microliter of blood in a given class of conditions what is the number of range of parasites that are in blood. And on and on, it's incredibly valuable to be able to do this. And since there are implications and a lot of challenges that we will deal with have biological implications on them, this data set actually becomes really useful. So play around with this. I'm not going to spend too much time on it. I just want to say something about how this database played out during COVID itself. When COVID spread, Ron and Rob and many other people actually put together this kind of a COVID sort of statistics because people were starting to toss numbers around, and it was a beautiful educational project. And many of these numbers were then published in newspapers around the world just to get people to think. I mean, people were debating around the mask and say, oh, now I understand this. And it was valuable to be able to have people grapple with the original source of information. And, of course, later on in the class, we will talk a lot about disinformation. Today, I'm kind of keeping that out of the way. I want us to first learn how to tackle with and build arguments with information. Later on, I'm hoping that we'll bring a few sets of people. There are a few people that have worked remarkably well on also disinformation because numbers sometimes can also be used to misguide people. There is a lot of malicious use of numbers. The simplest one is, oh, wait a second, the virus is only 100 nanometers. My mask has a 1 micron gap. Masks don't work. Now, you are completely removing kind of how the fundamental physics of masks actually work, but somebody can use this number to push an argument one way or the other. So it's important for you to kind of realize, although we're not going to spend too much time on that. This is a beautiful kind of a thread for, COVID is still around us. I don't know if you all saw the numbers currently are the second highest. So don't forget about this object. Think about it a little more. And do take a look at this. It's actually written and done very well as an infographics. The thing that I wanted to mention a little bit about this is an extra assignment. I think early on, I don't want you to delve too much into it. But on the other hand, if some of you have artistic interest, it is also important not just to find information, but how to represent it. So you will see a huge slew of what is called information visualization. We'll talk a little bit about it at a later point of time when we actually do some assignments. But just keep something like that in mind. It's quite fun to be able to not just come up with numbers, but present them in a manner that will just surprise people and actually get them to pay attention. Okay, so let's do a little bit of a exercise now. Let's find some numbers and see why they surprise you. This is a little bit about doing this exercise, and I'm just curious, you all can do this exercise separately, but to the class of problems that some of you have already been thinking about, can you share a number that kind of jumps out immediately that I wish if I knew? Like Raghav, you mentioned you've thought about healthcare and sustainability of healthcare. You have practiced in the UK. You don't have to come up with how to arrive at that number, but I'm curious for the problems that you all care about. What might be something that you might want to measure or might want to estimate? And I just want to get a few sets of feelers because we will use those examples in the class to then develop those further. It also just lets me understand people's interests. Also, they don't have to be related to the problem. They could be completely unrelated because it's snowing outside right here. So what's going out in my mind right now is how many snowflakes are falling per unit time per meter square. So it can be whatever you see around you, but I want you to kind of express yourself in a quantitative way. Anybody can just jump in.
One thing I was thinking about, and I'm just sort of brainstorming here, is
this is
anesthetic.
all the thing on the top, and you'll see we'll do a lot of this. So this is just an exercise to break a little ice amongst each other. Go ahead, Raghav.
Anesthetic gases, some of them, like desflurane, have a huge outsized impact on sort of climate impact. So one of the questions I would have is trying to understand what proportion of surgical procedures use that type of gases, why guidelines haven't adapted, and think a bit more deeply about the quantitative issues with that.
What a beautiful idea. I mean, that is just so interesting what you said. Do you know which anesthetic gas has the highest kind of?
I think desflurane or sevflurane have very high, essentially like greenhouse impact. But I would have to double check to be certain.
I mean, I just absolutely love what you said. Something that I have never thought about, and this is why the power of numbers is important. It might turn out that the impact is so small that we should never think about it ever again. Or it might turn out that it's the outsize effect and oh my God, what are we actually doing? And it could be somewhere in the middle. But I am completely crippled without numbers. Like how many surgeries happen, how much gas is used, how many molecules, what happens to that gas, what is this accumulation rate? I need to know the numbers associated with what you said very explicitly about their greenhouse effect. And in one afternoon, you can actually calculate to say, oh my God, I've arrived at an incredible problem. And, I think it's very clear you've thought about this problem, but you might not take action until you do that crossover point and you find that the cow's farts, which everybody knows that cows generate a ton of methane. We're all worried about it. There's a huge sustainability issue around greenhouse gases. You might calculate and show that it's actually an impact larger than that. And it will transform people to be thinking, and not just you, it can convert other people to be thinking about that same problem. Absolutely love it. Okay, this is going to be on the assignment for sure. Other problems. And, it doesn't have to be very specifically to a problem that you're thinking about. This is a little bit about practice. So I just want you to make up problems that then you can actually solve.
Okay, I have one.
Yeah.
It's a small, I would say, local Stanford level problem that maybe there are a large number of abandoned bikes that I see on campus, and I think it could be worthwhile just having estimates of like bikes that just end up being locked and not recycled or reused. So something
No,
along
I
those lines.
absolutely love it. It also just teaches us a little bit about why bicycles are abandoned. I actually don't understand that very well either. If you find that a percentage of abandoned bicycle is a significant portion, even 5% of all active bicycles, that's actually puzzling. And you can also think a little bit about in the context of I don't know how long have all of you been on this campus. I have definitely had two of my bikes stolen. Uh, so I think if you can put some of those numbers in there too, actually, that would actually be really fun. So I think this is now a great example that you should do these problems for fun also. They don't all have to be scary numbers. They can just be fun. Anything else that's going on in people's mind?
I guess I have a problem that I've been thinking about. I've been thinking about the impact of microgrids and smaller based electricity for more rural communities like India, and how that could potentially be beneficial to increase access to water, electricity, running water, things like that.
So then what would you want to estimate eventually in that space? I guess how many current microgrids exist in some sense?
Yeah, I think like off the top of my head, I would be interested in looking at specifically how many people could be impacted based on current infrastructure existence.
Mm-hmm.
And then also interested in cost.
Mm-hmm.
And then probably
I think power consumption becomes very important.
yeah.
I think I had a chat, and you will see, I'll invite one of the coordinators of the Rohingya camp. So we looked at this problem very specifically in refugee camps. The Bangladesh camps right now go on the upward of 1 million people.
Wow.
But of course, because of landslides and the area in Bangladesh that these Rohingya migrants have been put in, there are lots of landslides there. So everybody moves, and hence there is no permanent infrastructure. So there are no electrical lines, and every few months, what they call home has to be shifted to another location because of the rainfall and many of the climate things, and erosion, frankly, because they don't have any fuel sources, so they cut the trees. There's massive erosion in that area. But everybody has a cell phone. And actually, you reminded me in the context of microgrids. Every year I try to find one photograph that kind of takes my breath away. And I'm going to show all of you that photograph. No, it's not the photograph that I took. It's just a photograph that talks to me. I'm not a good photographer, but I want to show you this. because this is a problem that we will be taking on as a class. I'm hoping some of you would want to join this. It is a photograph. This is not the exact one, but I think it does the job. Actually, here is the photograph. So let me pull it out. You know, what you said, of course, this is a little bit ironic that I'm saying this. The whole class is about numbers, but I'm also just communicating emotion, which numbers sometimes can and cannot. So this is a photograph. I learned about this talking to many of the migrants, the fact that microgrids or solar panels are as important as their cooking pot. So what you're looking at on the back of this person is all their belongings. And, you know, it evokes to me this emotion that technology indeed plays an important role in a difference. Actually, I mean, the way that the person is carrying the kid also is this backpack. They would walk for incredible long times, sometimes many, many days to be able to do these types of journeys. And it reminded me of something. And the only thing that solar panel really does is charges his cell phone. And, you know, when you say microgrids, this is the extreme version of the microgrid, that you're carrying a microgrid on your backpack. So, you know, I mean, I got reminded of this picture. This would be fantastic, but I think when you are thinking about these problems, maybe we'll talk about it a little bit, but now I'm reminded that often enough, try to find visual cues of that problem. Not that you need that photograph to be convinced, because you've studied that problem like a scientist, but others will need that visual representation to believe that what you are saying. You know, some people are very quantitative, some people are very emotional, and it's very important to be able to convince your arguments through that way. Okay, we'll just take one more, and then we'll jump into kind of what the assignment for the class will be. Anybody else? This is really fun. I'm already realizing this is going to be a fun semester or quarter. Anything else that people have been thinking about that you could say that this is your chance to give your entire class an assignment?
I guess this is a bit unrelated to like an actual science problem, but I am kind of interested in like media coverage of science, and specifically like getting like a good sense of like, for example, what like is there like a particular topic or like region that's covered more than others, like proportionally to like the number of articles published versus like what's actually covered in like popular like science magazines or like I guess like New York Times and things like that, and how like viewership or like responses actually fuel or actually like detract from that.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
I mean, fabulous idea, especially also because the numbers for this are all there. Because you could look at citations, you look at number of papers published in a given area or region in the world, and you can look at the news coverage very directly. I think one thing that relates to this problem a little bit has been in we had some meetings with a few folks at the African Academy of Sciences, and India has a little bit of that framework, and I know many of you, if you at least some colleagues in India, there are places and times where spectacular science happens, but it does not get the limelight. This is a little bit of a problem also in the review process itself, that there is this bias that gets created that, oh, this paper is from faraway place that you don't know, and hence they don't get the fair review process even to begin with, because of course, English is not the native language sometimes. I think that would be fabulous, and especially in science coverage associated by certain sets of stories. Now you might realize that it's also a little bit tricky on how you might find statistics, and you might have to reduce your first analysis just to New York Times. And then I'm sure there is a coder in this room right here that can write a script that can crawl a few media sites and actually come up with those sets of numbers of how many times Stanford is mentioned in Washington Post, for example. I'm hoping all for the good reasons, but we also know it's mentioned for other reasons too. So, you know, yeah, fabulous idea. I think it kind of tickles you a little bit about whether you might have to make some estimates itself as well. So kind of, I think now jumping onto what will be the assignment for this week is definitely around the side that I would like you get to choose what is the problem that you want to calculate numbers on. It does not have to be anything related to the projects that you're excited about, or even an area that this is purely an exercise. And frankly, you should do this 3 or 4 times, not just one time, if you really want to be good at this. There are some very subtle things that you have to learn along the way in this process. So, but I think often enough to me and the way I choose, I haven't talked too much about evaluation in this class, and maybe I'll just say a word or two in that space. You're all A students for me. Doesn't really matter. We're not here for the grades. And so it's very important that when I say something that you should try it, I trust you that you will try it. Anybody who wants to share that work should share that work. It's very important. But on the other hand, make sure that you're choosing a problem that you're passionate about. That's the most important thing that matters to me. Other than that, everything else is fungible in some sense. So choose a problem for this week, try to do an estimate, and then next time when we meet again, we will share some of those. Maybe next Thursday, we'll dedicate like 10, 15 minutes of the class, people walking through and just publicly sharing what they ended up finding, especially if some of you can uncover surprises. And the idea is to surprise yourself, that's all. Okay, so is the assignment clear? And I think I'll talk a little bit about estimation now and give you a little more tools to actually conquer and do this. And then at the end of the class, we can also discuss this. So I think, one thing that what I meant by surprise, sometimes you will choose a problem that the answer of it will surprise you so much that you will completely transform as a person when you're thinking about that problem. And that happened for me personally when I read this paper. Ron's lab had been doing for quite a long time this idea of Anthropocene, and just Anthropocene by the numbers. And there is a fabulous website that they have recently released called Anthropocene by the Numbers. How many of you have actually seen this site? Just kind of a raise of hands. Okay, only 1 or 2. So you're up for a big surprise. So just like what we did for cell kind of a where is the site? Anthropocene numbers, human impact database. This is kind of a summary. And frankly, if any of you care about our planet, this image should just be literally ingrained in your head. It's quite a complex data set, but we will just do this as let's go to this website. And it's called the Human Impacts Database. I'm going to type how many pigs are alive today. Come on, just number of pigs. It doesn't have the, I know, it knows about pigs. Okay, pigs. There are 10 to the power 9 standing pigs at this moment. Why might I care about pigs? I could say, oh, how many humans are standing? And you might immediately realize, wait a second. So let's do that for chicken. Annual production mass of chicken products across the, it's remarkable in terms of what these databases can do. And it's really important to be able to get used to this in the context of numbers if you're going to choose the kinds of problems that you're excited about. The thing that happened for me personally was really just as a context of a question when this paper came out. The paper is just a summary of some few surprises that they found in trying to build the sets of numbers. I highly recommend this paper, and especially for folks that are excited about some climate-related problems in the class. It's a really fantastic starting point. And the question that they, there are lots of questions that they asked, but here's a quiz or a puzzle to you. In the living biomass What do you think on the planet? How would you arrange and organize? Is the livestock the largest biomass? Is bacteria the largest? Is humans the largest biomass on this planet? Is plants, fish? Any uh, anybody has a hunch? What do you think? If you do the numbers, what might come out? What is the heaviest, like from a biomass perspective, thing on this planet, biologically created? How much? Let's just talk about carbon, for example, which is a good estimate of a biological system. Any guesses? I'm just curious as sometimes how off we are in our intuition. Microbes. So Claudia has microbes as number one. Anybody else?
I think fungi in the form of like mosses or something that's like covering the earth.
Soil, like biomass in the soil with fungi. That's a good one. I think is that Lucas said plants. Any other guesses before any other winners? Nobody thinks humans are the.
More biomass in the ocean. I don't
I
know what we
that's
would. Yeah,
that's a good
I
point.
was
I mean, I'm talking about both of them. So you could say fish, for example. You could say microbes in the
I would
ocean.
like microbes and maybe smaller organisms in the ocean.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean,
Maybe
you could say
more.
viruses for that matter. For example, it might turn out that the total biomass for viruses is higher. And this is what I meant that when you do this systematically very well, some real surprises. And I think just to Irene, to kind of validate what you were thinking, the total volumetric biosphere on our planet, 90% or more of the volumetric habitable biosphere is actually in the ocean. The terrestrial ecosystem is a very small, even when you include the atmosphere and many sets of things from a habitability perspective, the volume of the ocean is just remarkable. I mean, 70% of the area, 4 kilometer average depth, life is everywhere, although it's not distributed equally. So I'll just show you guys some of the summary of this paper. Highly, highly recommend reading this paper. It'll convince you. So first of all, plants win. That's interesting. I hadn't thought about it when I saw that it's bacteria are pretty high up there. So just, I mean, let me just make this a little bit clear. So here is the total global biomass. 546 billion tons of carbon is in the biological sphere. You could also compare this to show how much carbon is in the atmosphere total. And of course, some of you know these sets of numbers from ppm. That's actually much smaller. And you would realize immediately that biology is a dominant force on this planet. Suddenly now you look at bacteria, 70 billion. I mean, that's a massive percentage. I mean, you think about this is 82%, that's 12% of that. Fungi, actually, I mean, it's a pretty good number that you thought, like, so 2%. They are 12 billion. They do give bacteria a run for their money, but don't really have a chance. Archaea are a significant portion. I mean, think about the number of papers that have been published on archaea versus everything else. It's a minuscule amount that we know, but the estimates are really around 1.5% of the biomass. And then you go in and you see we haven't even reached, the viruses are right here. And this little blob here is all the animals, all the arthropods, all the fishes on the ocean, and right there is the human biomass. And look at this, just, I mean, what we all deeply care about sometimes. This is the current estimate. It never used to be that way, but look at just humans and wild mammals. So 2.5% of the animal biomass, and this is 0.3% of the animal biomass. So humans far super succeed at this point, just the total biomass that might be. And then you might find something quite funny, which I just loved when I saw this. I had this intuition, nematodes. I know some of you think about C. elegans and in biology. The biomass and volume in nematodes is larger than all the enigmatic animals and wild birds and mammals that you actually care about. So worms dominate the planet compared to elephants and anything else. It's kind of an interesting scenario. So if you are thinking about how these sets of processes might be at play, you have to think about this. And again, I think another big surprise that was a really important thread is that they showed that the biological sphere has now been taken over by what mass we have made on this planet. So in 2020, the dry weight essentially of buildings and infrastructure that we created crossed over what biology has created. I know some of you mentioned interest in synthetic biology, and so just, if you think about this, for the very first time, so plastic is 8 gigaton and animals are 4 gigaton. I mean, what a remarkable time to be living in, that we have produced more plastic than all the animal combined. And this is a crossover time that just happened around 2020, when the total biomass and the human produced mass, this was the crossover point right here, plus minus a couple of years. So, I think I just want to emphasize this idea that numbers are really, really powerful. I was thinking about talking a lot more about ocean numbers, but I'm looking at time. And let me just share a few sets of resources, and then maybe I'll give more examples. But I think I'm hoping you're all convinced that numbers matter. And if you're not, then find me afterwards. I'll spend a lot more time convincing you that numbers matter. Now, just a few sets of sources that I use for just day-to-day work sometimes that I like. Especially in the context of global health, there is a phenomenal database, and I'll share these slides. Our World in Data, fantastic place, well-trusted, has a phenomenal numbers of kind of more social metrics that you might be interested in. Of course, there is the SDG tracker. You can find how well we are doing. So if you're interested in water, you can go to SDG tracker. Try to find how many sets of communities might have access to water, for example. There is this context of thinking a lot more about global health. So the visual history of global health is a fantastic data set. This is a subset of the Our World in data. WHO has a data website, which is called the Global Health Observatory, which is kind of essentially an inclination of all the sets of indicators. It comes out in reports. I find it quite hard to tease out the reports, so I really like these databases in general because they are searchable. There is GHDX, yet another database, fantastic in terms of what can be done. There is a GHS index, and I think I'll mention all of these kind of in a framework that you have access to. I think maybe a comment that I'll do and realize is, although data was used quite a lot in COVID, there was also misrepresentation of data itself. And I think if some of you are very interested in this, I would highly recommend Rukmini's book. You could also just read some pieces by her. She analyzed what happened in India, and she looked at, what is called whole numbers and half truths, which is how governments and other agencies can sometimes not present the whole truth. And again, it's just, hers is a way of just looking at numbers and what was presented. And sometimes two sources of data sets were not matching. The number of people that were infected was not matching the kinds of, say, what was happening in the hospitals. And so, be aware of, when you are looking at these sets of resources, that there might be biases, and people do have biases. We have looked at some biases, for example, in malaria data sets, and I do feel sometimes malaria is underreported because people want to project progress, but it takes money and time to be able to get to everybody, which is hard. Okay, so I think that's all I want to say. I am saving some of the Fermi problems because I'm realizing I want to spend a lot more time with you all doing some Fermi problems together, but maybe I'll just leave this historical context of the Fermi problem with you all. This is Fermi. Oh, actually, I see a question. Go ahead, Yushin.
I have a question. So if, let's say, we use the SDG tracker, and then we find interesting question that's very outstanding, that I assume there are so many people who are working on it at the same time. So how do you like go about finding out what are people working on a certain problem and find synergy between, as opposed to everyone just working at the same time and wasting effort?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of ways of saying this. Frankly, not enough people are working in the perspective of social change and the context of, difficult problems require the kind of grit. So frankly, it's perfectly okay if somebody else is also working on a very important problem, like providing safe water to people around the world. Let more flowers bloom. It's a little bit of a different thinking as compared to when sometimes in academia or very scientific problems we're like, oh, will our contribution matter? Because you would bring, there are so many flavors to the problem in itself that the context that you might have chosen, you will end up with a new way of thinking, a new class of solutions. So first of all, one thing is to not worry too much about it. Now, the second part of this puzzle is it is valuable to for certain class of problems, there are these hubs that you can go to that where people come together and share solutions. It doesn't happen that often, but there are, in education, for example, there is a lot of work that people do where sets of things that have worked in one place are then replicated some other places. So there are certain places and meetings that you can go to, like malaria. Everybody who's working on malaria tries to come to this particular place, and you might find that might be the first place to overview what's happening. And I think a third way to look into this a little bit is be open about what you are working on. And this is kind of why we will later on talk about this. Just like you find it hard that other people might be working on these problems, and if they don't share it, you can't find it, the same applies to you. And so if I'm working on malaria and I don't tell anybody, how else is somebody else supposed to know that we've been developing a malaria diagnostics now for 8 years? So it's a little bit of a chicken and an egg. I think there is a problem sometimes. There is also a lot of grandstanding in this space. And what I mean by that in a true sense is there could be a claim that's made because people want to just claim a territory. There is a lot of that in plastic, for example. So removal of plastics, there is a lot of grandstanding sometimes, and the numbers, when you look at them, don't match. But because sets of entities got started, all the resources get sucked in that one place, and sometimes new ideas don't get the space that's needed. So, this is a very subtle question. If you find a problem that you're deeply excited about, and you, after a lot of thinking, feel you have something new to contribute, it is worth your time because the problem is what you're passionate about. And I often, in this space, the worry, let me say this another way. The challenge is in implementation. Of course, the challenge is first finding a solution, but there is another place you can be unique, which is how you implement a solution. And that combination of those two end up being in a scenario that it's actually worthwhile. And I think, some places you will find solutions that are more public. There was a talk about this for open source solutions. For example, there is a website called Appropedia, which is a short form of Appropriate Technologies Wikipedia, where anybody who's working in the space tries to post what they do. It's totally outdated. It doesn't have everything. So we need it. I mean, maybe what you could do is you could say, hey, that's the problem I want to work on. I want to build a glue. And I think, what we are trying to do in this community and be open about what we do is a little bit of that also. There are a couple online platforms that are starting to come that are really good at documentation, for example. But maybe we do need a repository of solutions that are not being implemented right now. So then you don't worry too much about the coming up with the solution. You just jump directly to implementation. I think last year or 2 years ago, we had a project where somebody looked at this in the context of biomaterials and asked how many remarkable materials have already been invented, but are not being used. And it was a little bit in that direction where, frankly, as scientists, we love creating stuff. Getting them to people is hard. And you get excited about the next problem. I'm guilty of that same thing. You all will find that challenging. So I think there is a lot of space there. Any question related to this, or kind of what the assignment we're going to try to do? Okay, so I think maybe I'll just say one word and we'll call it a day today. The thing that I wanted to just mention is just introduce this idea of a Fermi problem, but I'm realizing I want to do a much more detailed session on scaling laws and Fermi than I have the time to do. So let me just propose, just historically, why is Fermi so famous for this? He would walk around, of course, he's a physicist that some of you have heard about, and he would invent and quiz people about problems. So the most famous one, and you'll see there's a slight difference between what I'm calling Fermi problems and just getting to the numbers, because you have to also assume some things where numbers do not exist. And so he's very famous for saying how many Chicago piano tuners there are in the city of Chicago. And you can solve this yourself many different ways, a method that many people then kind of played around with. And this is, I just want to highlight the assume part. So we know the population of Chicago is 3 million. He assumes that an average family contains 4 members, so that gives you the number of families. Then he assumes that 1 in 5 family owns a piano. Now, how the hell did he know that, right? But that could be just that, oh, I visit my friends and I have average friends, and once a while I see a piano. Now, you could make this assumption and you're totally flat out wrong, and everything you calculate after that is going to be wrong. But what's very important is in your assignment, if you make any assumption because a number that you couldn't find, please write that down, because you can go back and correct it. And then the other thing that he does now, once you know the number of pianos, is to how long does it take for a piano tuner to actually tune a piano? You know, you can service 4 pianos every day. You actually don't work on weekends. You also take vacations. You divide that all up. You can calculate the number of piano tuners that are needed for all pianos to be tuned. Now, that is also a huge assumption, because some people might never tune their pianos, but it just gives you the scenario of thinking a little bit about assumptions. And then the only thing here is, when you are writing this assignment up, try to explicitly write down assumptions you made, because you can go back and correct it. If you didn't write that down, it'll become a little bit tricky, what you made up and what you actually found the data. And it's the combination of the two. So kind of going back to Abhimanyu's problem, he could go and walk around the yard and calculate how many abandoned bicycles he sees. That's real data, cannot refute it. But on the other hand, he might also think a little bit about, I have walked around a little bit and I have an intuition every now and then I see an abandoned bike. And from that, let me just estimate rather than actually going and measuring it. It is his lived experience that led to that assumption, and it's perfectly okay, as long as you make a distinction between the two. Because if you don't make the distinction, everything will merge into numbers and then you'll be confused what I actually know versus what I assumed. Does that make sense? And, I think this is all common sense. You'll see the more you practice this, this will become useful. Okay, so that's all I wanted to cover today. That's kind of the assignment for today. Take your time. Thursday, we will discuss this a little bit more in depth in terms of thinking about what you might. So think about this over the weekend. You can share your half kind of work that's in progress on Discord for people to comment. Hope we should create a channel just for this assignment, just by the numbers. People can just post a problem. You could ask, for example, a number that you're finding really hard to find. Somebody else might actually be really good at digging out that number. And this is also another way of just helping each other in some sense. So, for example, somebody brought up the anesthetic. There might be somebody in this room that already knows quite a lot about papers in the space of the greenhouse effect. and they might be able to dig up a quick paper and say, hey, here is your number that you were looking for. So try to help each other in that way. This is why I like doing these types of problems in the public. I'm excited about what types of problems you all will choose, and I might toss some of them in the mix. So if you're having a really hard time finding a problem, you can also choose from some mixtures that we can post. You can also work on the same problem that somebody else is working on, and then we could compare how off the two numbers are. That would actually also be fun. Okay, so I think that's the assignment. We're gonna call it a day. Any questions so far? I think the slide PDF, I can just post it online on the Discord itself, just so you have the kind of online resources. And if you are spending time, I highly recommend spend time on the Anthropocene by the numbers. Play with that website as much as you can. You will find some really remarkable insights hidden in that data set. For the global health folks, there is a ton of websites to play. So sometimes just spending time on these sites is also useful. Okay, any last minute comment before we call it a day? Just logistics wise, there's no lab this week. We have to set up certain sets of things, and we're kind of going to start the first optics lab next week. Any comments, questions? This is kind of that open mic time. You can also just share anything else that you want to share that has nothing to do with the class sometimes. I'm excited about all of you meeting in person soon enough, and apologies that hasn't happened yet, but I'm hoping that'll happen soon.
I have a question.
Yes.
I know we're meeting in the Oitengsu teaching lab. I've
Yes.
never heard of that before. Where is that?
Hope, can you explain where it is?
It's Sriram room 112.
Oh, okay. Got it. Thank you.
If you come to the building, go all the way to the left, and it's a giant room and has a little conference room. You all will have access to it. You can use that as a working space because this is a project class. You're allowed to hang out there 24/7 anytime. You can use that as a meeting space for your teams. There's a little conference room there. Of course, there are other classes that are happening, but you'll find most of the time it's empty. All the meetings that I do one-on-one will actually also be in that space, so it's actually very useful.
Thank you.
I guess a
Any
quick
other
note, please
comments?
do your safety training to get access to the lab space and be familiar with it. There should be some nice sort of videos and walkthroughs to get you familiar with the space before you come in, and some safety forms for you to, and courses for you to fill out to make sure we all have a safe and good time in the lab.
Yes, the safety forms and the safety training is mandatory. And, you're all expected to create something new that has not existed, which will require you to build things, and building things requires you to work in that space safely. There's a very nice machine shop there that people can get trained. There's an electronics bench. There's a lot of other tools that we can make accessible across. How many of you are trained in PRL, by the way? I just want to have a sense. So only 3. Anybody else trained in the PRL yet? Anybody was hoping to get trained in the PRL around this time or no? Okay, how many of you are actually, you feel you're comfortable in the machine shop? How many of you worked in the machine shop before? Even if not on this campus, somewhat? Okay, so this is valuable because these sets of folks will become some of your go-to people early on. And then, of course, anything that you want to get trained in, we can get you trained in. Any sets of tools that you're excited about on campus, we can find them. But it's valuable to think and rely a little bit on skills that other people. How many people have kind of made from scratch a PCB, for example? Have a little bit of kind of electronics background. Okay, I see Lucas. Anybody else has designed simple small circuits? Arduinos, how many of you have played with those before? Okay, that's a bigger number. Raspberry Pis, that's also a decent, good number. So, I think post this in your little blurbs to just say, I'm assuming the same goes for computational tools like, oh, I like MATLAB a lot. Just, like I had highlighted Raghav was like, oh, I'm a physician, or at least I'm trained as a physician. Just put that in because that'll give people a chance to say you have resources amongst us itself. And I'll do that with also the larger cohort too, where you'll find just a lot of professionals take this class sometimes. And so I rely on them to also do lots of fun teaching of a completely new skill that they might bring to the table. So in your introductions, please try, like we will get lawyers, for example, taking this class. And if you have a legal question, I mean, why ask me when we have a lawyer taking a class? So please make sure that you're open about many other skills that you might have that are useful. Like there might be a sailor in this room for that matter. And if you're excited about the ocean, it's valuable. So I think the more open you are about, it's not that you're only acting as a guiding point. It's not as if more work is falling on you. It's just sometimes a conversation, and sometimes you might get excited and then help a team more or less. And then I will ask also the older alumni to engage in the class too, and they also act as mentors. Okay, with that note, I'll say bye. I'm hoping to see you all soon. Oh, any last minute questions or? Okay, this is a raise of hands to say bye. All right, bye everyone. Enjoy your weekend.